Welcome to the video lecture on religions, a chapter of the volume The European Experience, a multi-perspective history of modern Europe, produced by the Teaching European History at the 21st Century Project. The chapter has been co-written by a team of 8 historians from universities of Utrecht, Lille, Madrid, Berlin, and Budapest. I'm one of them. My name is Péter Erdősi, and I'm from Budapest. In this volume, the chapter on religions appears in Unit 6, Living with Difference, along with the ones on ideologies, centers and peripheries, as well as generations and life cycles. The location of the topic shows that religions are seen as elements contributing to the experience of diversity in European history. As with other chapters of the book, this one too has a tripartite structure. Covering the immense period of 500 years, it dedicates a subchapter to each historical phase: early modern, modern, and contemporary. A glimpse at some of the key concepts and topics of the chapter may indicate that diversity is a key term, not only in the early modern part, but in the entire chapter too, in accordance with the concept of Unit 6. Various contexts, political, cultural, even economic ones, have been used to highlight the different roles religions have played in European societies. The wide geographical scope of the chapters is notable too, along with Western phenomena, their counterparts from Central and Eastern Europe, the Ottoman Empire, or the former Soviet Union appear. A major change occurring within the ample time frame is the process in which early modern confessionalization recedes and modern tolerance, secularization emerges, followed by the contemporary separation of church and state. Our story begins with an introduction to the religious upheaval of Europe following the success of Luther's ideas. But in contrast with the conventional master narrative of the split within Christianity, in which Reformation led to a conflict between Protestants and Catholics, we have emphasized a more pluralistic reality of religious situations across early modern Europe, leading to a more diverse picture that pays attention to Judaism, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and factions within Protestantism, as well as Catholicism. From the 1520s onwards, Western Christianity crumbled. One of the examples illustrative of the changing landscape of Europe is the religious fragmentation of the Germanic area. By virtue of the cuius regio, eius religio, whose realm, their religion, a principle that, coupled with political fragmentation, prevailed at the time of the Peace of Augsburg of 1555. To analyze the reactions of populations to the new religious situation, historians have used the concept of confessionalization. This concept suggested that the rivalry between Catholic and Protestant confessions had contributed to shaping the institutional and social realities of the various states and cities of the Holy Roman Empire, and to differentiating them through the construction of antagonistic identities. Catholic, Lutheran, and Calvinist spaces emerged and defined themselves in opposition to each other in increasingly exclusive and intolerant ways. Political elites acquired the power to impose their religious choices on the population. States and churches would subject the population to social discipline by means of acculturating mechanisms, inculcating the faithful with the norms of their rulers. Civil and ecclesiastical authorities thus turned believers steeped in superstition into true Catholics, Lutherans, or Calvinists. The confessionalization of Europe, of European populations, was never complete. In the first decades of the Reformation, many people were hesitant Their adherence to a particular confession, often incomplete or based on a vague knowledge of doctrinal differences. And indeed, confessional boundaries were still fluid in this period of heated theological debate. Once confessional identities were more firmly established in the second half of the 16th century, diversity of belief remained a reality in many places. Minorities, whether tolerated or clandestine, continued to exist. In areas where they were officially tolerated, solutions had to be found to live together and coexist in difference, which was not without difficulties and violence. The higher echelons of European trade were always home to coexistent beliefs. If Venice instituted the first Jewish ghetto in history, when the Jews of the city were grouped together in 1516, the very same city owes also Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, Jewish, and Muslim merchants rubbing shoulders on a daily basis. While the European continent was gradually fragmented by religious differences, the struggle between religions led to a profound transformation of the Catholic Church itself. Principles defined by the Council of Trent would govern the new model of church, which emerged as a response to the Reformed confessions expanding in Europe. In Catholic Europe, the Tridentine decrees were imposed in different ways. In Spain, Philip II set himself up as a champion of the faith and adopted the decrees through royal patronage and other proselytizing instruments. Such dynamics were closely followed by the Holy Inquisition, a religious tribunal charged with preserving the Catholic religion in the face of heterodox movements. In the Pontifical Court, the post-conciliar popes introduced profound modifications to make Rome the head of the church. In other territories, religious coexistence was determined by anti-Catholic policies, which, as in the case of Ireland, ended up provoking a migratory movement towards Spain, the Netherlands, and France in the late 16th and 17th centuries, and the activation of missionary strategies for the preservation of the Catholic religion. The fact that it took almost 20 years for the Council of Trent to formulate anew the Article of Faith indicates that the post-Tridentine regime was not easily constructed, and different schools of thought continued to flourish even in the 17th century. Both Catholicism and Protestantism harbored a plurality of strands due to intraconfessional theological or political disagreements. Exile and diaspora had formative impact on both religion and learning. The Huguenots, Protestants who had fled France and the southern Low Countries, set up their own Latin-French communication networks all across the northern part of Europe. These migrants contributed to the scholarly institutionalization of Protestantism via professorships, the book industry, and journalism. The Huguenots were not the only religious group to go into exile and spread out over early modern Europe. Sephardic Jews moved out of the Iberian Peninsula, fleeing religious persecution and setting up communities in London and Amsterdam, where they met with Ashkenazi Jews, creating vast economic and intellectual networks. Jews occupied important positions in such port cities as Livorno and Amsterdam, whereas Vilnius was an important theological center. For the religious heterogeneity of Central Europe, the Principality of Transylvania is a case in point as far as conflict and compromise are concerned. And on this map, the Principality of Transylvania appears in the easternmost zone of Central and Eastern Europe, where the stripes show a mixed presence of Lutherans, Calvinists, and Unitarians. It's in present-day Romania. A fragment of the Hungarian kingdom falling to pieces with Ottoman conquest, Transylvania, as a newly established state, was paying annual tribute to the Ottoman Porte. Despite confessional upheavals, religious controversy was moderated by a system of compromise stemming from a series of laws issued by the Transylvanian Diet during the late 16th century. The result of these legal instruments was the official acknowledgement of 4 accepted religions: Calvinist, Lutheran, anti-Trinitarian or Unitarian, and Catholic. Religions other than these 4 were merely tolerated by the state. Elsewhere too, early modern realpolitik, aimed at coexistence, was influential, even if such politics were not yet informed by the positive philosophies of tolerance and expressions of epistemic humility that were formulated during the 18th century. Thinkers of the Enlightenment then helped precipitate revolutionary changes by suggesting new visions of human rights, civil society, and the modern constitutional monarchy. Much has been made of secularization in this century of enlightenment, but it should be underscored that religion continued to be a major political force and that the number of people who claimed to be atheist was still very small. The religious history of 19th century Europe was profoundly influenced by the French Revolution. From the emancipation of the Jews and Protestants to the attempt to create a civic religion and the abolition of Catholicism as a state religion, this revolutionary episode encapsulates the upheavals in European religious practice throughout the 19th century. This era was marked by an intense philosophical, artistic, and scientific effervescence alongside debates on dogmas and religious institutions. The affirmation of modernity and the aspiration to freedom born out of the French Revolution forced governments and religious authorities to redefine their respective position within a changing society and to compete for control over education, thus laying the foundations of contemporary Europe. The Industrial Revolution transformed the economy and society of much of Europe during the 19th century, characterized by industrialization and the affirmation of science. The affirmation of a rationalist stance was decisive in the evolution of religious thought and practice. The progress of science favored a scientistic reading of the world, one of the major points of which was the theory of evolution, which denied divine creationism. The expansion of knowledge, the progress of industrialization, increasing urbanization, and the widening gap between the working classes and the churches contributed to a decline of religious practice. In return, the fragmentation of religious practice gave birth to new religious movements and favored the rise of new forms of piety. The French Revolution annihilated the tradition of monarchic rule by divine right and paved the way for the creation of society and state on the basis of human rights. Church lands were taken into public ownership in an attempt to finance the revolutionary changes taking place. The Jacobin regime persecuted the resistant Catholic priests, but instead of an atheist regime, the cult of the Supreme Being was established. General Napoleon Bonaparte decided to restore normal relations with Pope Pius VII. According to a new concordat made in 1801, the French clergy were to receive a regular income from the state. Protestants were granted freedom of religion. Many important elements in the modernization of society and public administration have spread through much of Europe via the Napoleonic Code, the civil code of the French of 1804. This preserved the enlightened absolutist practice of excluding churches as institutions from state administration. The application of human rights resisted the prescription of state religion because all are born with the freedom to follow any religion. The modern bourgeois state is thus neutral in matters of faith and regards churches as private societies supported by their faithful. Citizens, on the other hand, are free to form political organizations, parties, associations, advertise them in press, and so on. Europe in the 19th century was a continent in constant turmoil, far from being uniform with regards to concepts, developments, treatments, or even the given range of existing religions and denominations. In the first half of the century, the popes supported the Holy Alliance, in which the armies of the absolutist powers, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, oppressed the national and liberal movements. A Catholic restoration was aided by the new religious sensibilities intertwined with Romanticism, new waves of the cult of Virgin Mary, new regulated companies and orders of monks that emerged in the first half of the 19th century. The inspiring encounter of Romanticism and religion strengthened political restoration efforts. Throughout Europe, beyond the Catholic world too, in reaction to Enlightenment and the coldness of reason, Romanticism emphasized the exaltation of feeling and nature. After the French Revolution, the Romantics regretted the loss of belief at a time when the rise of science was promoting skepticism or even a generalized atheism. The middle of the 19th century was marked in Western Catholic countries and particularly in France by a new religious impetus that strengthened traditional faith in the face of the doubts inherited from the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. The rise of the twin threats of liberalism and rationalism and the acceleration of the rural exodus and urbanization, which expedited the uprooting and decline of religious practices. The 19th century saw a decline in the number of people attending Sunday Mass and Easter Mass. To raise awareness among the crowds, the Church favored a demonstrative devotion fueled by the splendor of liturgical festivals and a climate of miracles. For example, Marian apparitions at La Salette in 1846 or Lourdes in 1858. Catholicism took on a less severe, more indulgent and more sentimental phase than before. The preaching of hell receded and that of purgatory returned to the forefront. The multiplication and spread of particular devotions testify to the continuing movement towards the individualization of belief, which lent itself to a more affective and warm-hearted kind of piety. For Karl Marx, religion was an opium of the people, in the sense that religion was used by those in power to oppress workers, and that it brought spiritual comfort that distracted the proletariat from the revolution. But religion was at the heart of the debates and conflicts that shook the 19th century European societies. A force for conservatism or even reaction, but also a force for social reform. Religion adapted its messages and structures to the new context sketched out by urbanization and industrialization. In the struggle between conservatism and liberalism, churches have more often than not weighed in on the side of the status quo, but churches have also been on the side of emancipation and social progress, fighting for human dignity, building school systems, and providing assistance to the poor. In the contemporary phase, the chapter focuses on a series of key moments illustrating the 20th century transformations of religions in Europe. Beginning with laïcité and the official separation of church and state in France. The 1905 law on the separation of the churches and the state put an end to the regime established for the Catholic Church by the Concordat negotiated by Napoleon Bonaparte with Rome. Based on the neutrality of the state and the plurality of religions, this regime functioned for about a century. As a result of the new law separating churches and state, the French Republic no longer recognized legal relations between the public authorities and any religious denomination. However, the law did not exclude the presence of religions in society. Inspired by tolerance, it ensured freedom of conscience. This was, in fact, its raison d'être. The year 1917 was a major turning point for the history of Russia, as well as the Russian Orthodox Church. In the aftermath of revolutions and the Civil War, Bolshevik policies brought about a secularization that in practice resulted in the seizure of church lands, persecution of religious practices, and the cornering of the Orthodox Church. After Nazi Germany's attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin decided to restore relative normality to religious life and to revive the Russian Orthodox Church as a means of intensifying patriotic support for the war effort. In other regions of Europe, for example, in the Balkan area, the interwar period involved a process of construction of new national states. Here, our focus is on the breakup of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and pre-national Ottoman Empire and the making of new nation states, a topic prepared by the modern section of our chapter, which explained that the European lands of the Ottoman Empire, in other words, Romania, were inhabited by a multitude of religious communities. But in the 20th century, nearly all of the national identity concepts follow the pattern of one nation, one religion or confession in the Balkans. New national elites decided to expel those who were unwelcome due to their religious identity, while new fellow nationals could be drawn from other ends of their own group. The most prominent case of this unmixing of peoples is the Turkish-Greek population exchange. Religious affiliation alone turned out to be a death sentence for millions of people in the first half of the 20th century. During the Armenian genocide from 1915-1916, nearly the entire Armenian Christian population of the remaining Ottoman Empire was extinguished, whether directly or indirectly. It is estimated that at least 1 million Armenians died, while the death toll for Syria Christians targeted in the same context amounted to around 250,000 people. The most well-known case of genocide according to religious affiliation is the Holocaust, also called Shoah. Nearly the entire German and European Jewry, at least 6 million, were killed by the Nazis and their accomplices. In the post-World War II setting, the direction in which Catholicism was evolving was profoundly changed by the Second Vatican Council, symbolizing the openness of the Catholic Church to the modern world and contemporary culture, taking technological progress, the emancipation of peoples, and increasing secularization into account. For example, the Catholic Church recognized that there are elements of truth in other Christian churches, not mere heresies to be eradicated. The declarations on the relations with non-Christian religions and on religious freedom also mark a clear shift in favor of tolerance and religious freedom. 20th century religion developed very differently depending on the national context. In Spain, the church, in its strategy of survival after years of secularist republicanism, to restore its sphere of power, allied itself from 1939 with the Franco dictatorship, which in the post-war era redefined itself as a conservative, Catholic and anti-communist regime. Spanish Catholicism would thus enjoy decades of doctrinal and ideological hegemony. In the 1960s, however, this situation started to change as a result of the impact of the Second Vatican Council, the ideological process of liberation theology, a growing transfer of Catholics towards militancy and political commitment to the left, or at least to democratic proposals, the influence in the 1960s of Marxist doctrine in the Catholic and workers' rank. The role of the church in an increasingly secularized Spanish society was set in motion along with the increased militancy of Catholics and priests in dissident movements against Francoism. Spanish Catholicism played a decisive role in the transition to democracy after 1975 and participated in the signing of a constitution recognizing the existence of a secular state. By the 1980s, these changes allowed Spain to have a legal framework that regulated the life of an increasingly secularized society. In post-World War II Central and Eastern Europe, behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet-style dictatorships and ecclesiastical policies were introduced in countries occupied by the Red Army. In this zone, religion was subjected to various degrees of restriction. In Hungary, for example, where the 1956 revolution was defeated by the Soviets, the situation of the various religions improved from the 1960s. Churches in Bulgaria, Romania, and Yugoslavia worked under severe restraints. However, in Poland, the level of religious freedom remained extremely high for a communist state. The overwhelming majority of the people identified with the Roman Catholic Church, and it provided the spiritual and ideological backing for the Solidarity or Solidarność opposition movement, which in 1989 formed the first non-communist government in Central and Eastern Europe. As a result of regime change and democratic transition, Christians became more visible in all of the Central and Eastern European societies. And the appeal and the power of religions in all of the countries of the region was temporarily strengthened. Another consequence of the abolition of censorship was the appearance of different esoteric cults and alternative movements thriving strongly among other faiths. During the 20th century, religion remained a highly relevant category in Europe, whether on the side of the powerful, as in Spain, or as an important differentiator of national identity, as in Northern Ireland, or as a target for oppression, as in the case of the Holocaust or in the Balkan Wars. Besides traditional forms of religion like Catholicism, Protestantism, Judaism, Orthodoxy, Islam, and even Buddhism, the increasing impact of atheism, agnosticism, anti-religious regimes, alternative spiritual movements, civil religions, and immigrated religions also played a significant role. For students of history looking back on the last century, some 20 years after the millennium, the chapter has shown religion as a component of the European experience of living with diversity. From the early modern world of confessional conflict, it took a long time, it was a long process to reach tolerance, secularization, and the separation of church and state, and the freedom of conscience. The violent events of the 20th century, however, showed that these achievements could be very fragile in some situations. The chapter has explained that religious identities could, especially in times of crisis and political turmoil, be involved in discord. However, they have also added significant tones to the cultural variety of European societies in more peaceful contexts. At the end of the lecture, I'm encouraging you to read the chapter for more detail. And I thank you very much for your attention.